You might remember earlier I mentioned one of my favorite directives being vmodel. That's exactly what we're going to see now, and this is a really powerful and convenient one, and we're going to be using it heavily throughout the course. Vmodel is basically a shorthand for something we've already seen. We had to do some two-way binding earlier that required us to do vbind on a value and then v-on input, and there's a much faster and easier way of doing this. This is actually so common, Vue provides a shorthand, and that is going to be using vmodel, and we're going to use vmodel on value. And this is going to do exactly the same thing. Vmodel is basically short for two things. It's going to bind to a variable called value, and it's going to listen for an input variable, and then it's going to do two-way binding for us. Let's go ahead and see how this works. I'm going to delete both of these. We're just going to keep vmodel. We're now going to head down here and update our function. We are going to keep the value here, but what we don't need anymore is this input function. Let's go ahead and delete it. If we save this off, everything is actually going to continue exactly as it should be. Vmodel is just a shorthand for the exact same thing we wrote earlier. Very, very convenient. It doesn't just work on inputs, it's actually going to work on all sorts of different ones. So let's go ahead and see a few demos of that. At the moment, the default is going to be type is equal to text, so we've seen vmodel working with text. We can also use this with something like a radio button or a checkbox. Let's go ahead and see that. I'm going to create a radio button here, and it's going to be binding to vmodel value. We're going to create one more as well. Radio buttons are mutually exclusive, so only one can be selected at a time. I'm going to head down here and change the value of this. I'm just going to make this one A for now. Finally, we're going to go ahead and see if this is working. I'm going to interpolate on my A variable, and we're going to give both of these a default value. This one's going to be A, so it's going to be selected by default, and this one's going to be B, so it's not. Let's save it off and give it a try. You can see we have two variables here, and this should actually not be A, this should be value. If we save it off, we're currently on A. If we change to B, that's going to update automatically, and so on and so forth. We hardly wrote any code, but we have quite powerful two-way binding here. Definitely a very convenient feature of Vue. We've seen this working with radio button, but it's also going to work just fine with checkbox as well. Let's go ahead and try that out. I'm going to change this one to checkbox, and we're going to do exactly the same thing down here, changing this one to checkbox as well. Unlike a radio button, checkboxes are not mutually exclusive. You can select multiple checkboxes at the same time. And just to demonstrate this, we're going to change our value. Instead of using a single value here, it's going to be an array, and this can potentially contain both A and B. Save it off and try it out. So you can see at the moment we've got A entered here, and A is selected by default, and we're rendering that one up here inside of our template. If we go ahead and select B, that's actually going to select both of them, and we can unselect A and then unselect B and repeat the process. It's going to work just fine. We've also seen you can use vmodel on multiple inputs. Despite having two inputs, we're using the exact same data binding source, and that's going to work just fine as well. Throughout the course, we're going to see more uses of vmodel, for example with a text area and a dropdown, but for now we're going to just keep it at this. We've already introduced quite a lot of content. This might seem a little bit confusing and overwhelming at first, especially because vmodel is doing so much under the hood. Again, if you go back to the start of a lecture or the previous lecture, you can see this is just a shorthand for v-on and for binding to the value variable. Go ahead and play around with this a little bit and try and get used to it. We are going to see it a number of times coming up in the next section, so don't worry too much if it doesn't fully make sense. By the end of the course, you're going to be an expert from using vmodel so much. Let's go ahead and jump into the next lecture.